Ready? Okay. Welcome to the July meeting of the Southampton Village Planning Commission. I'm going to discuss tonight the proposal that was brought to the trustees by the building inspector and the former village attorney to pass a law about deer fencing. There's been a continual issue about deer in the village, particularly in the last 10 years. In 2012, there was also a law proposed to address the deer fence issue. At the time, the trustees asked the Planning Commission to comment, and C-Mac Sammy, who was chair of the Planning Commission at that time, wrote a letter to the trustees that I think, in summary, raised two issues. Number one, his concern about how fencing in the front yards would change the feel and look of the village, particularly in smaller local streets. And then secondly, concern that deer fencing would not ultimately address the issue, and that other tactics like culling seemed to he thought should be at least tried. As I said, the building inspector came back in April and proposed to the trustees that there be a deer fence law. He wrote a letter along with Rick DePetris, who was the former village attorney. The trustees had a hearing last week, I believe, about this issue, and they've asked the Planning Commission to comment. And Wayne Brune, the current village attorney, has drafted a law, a potential law to address the issue. So I want to throw it open first to the members of the commission to talk about the issue, what they think, the law, and then we'll take comments from the audience. Do you want to start?
Sure.
Yeah.
I am in favor of some type of deer fence law and some type of culling in the village. I think we need to do both. I do have questions as to how many deer they can actually cull in the village, due to lack of open space and the amount of private property we have, how that dynamic may work.
Right.
But I think it's certainly worthwhile to do some form of it.
Right.
We are inundated with deer.
Right.
And it's not just the village. I mean, the whole southern town, South Fork.
Right.
And as we read, Greenport, or Southold, struggling with the same issues. And they have a lot more open space over there.
Yeah.
I mean, I would share the concern about the deer. I'd be concerned if in the smaller neighborhoods, if it'll actually be effective. And this says, the language here, I don't know which text is the right one. It says, building inspector may condition a permit for a deer fence on the installation of hedging or planting. So it's not required that there be any kind of landscaping. So you could end up with all the smaller streets having 8-foot tall wire fences.
I read that
Which was my,
if you put up an
concern.
8-foot tall wire deer fence, you had to screen it 8 feet tall. That's what I had read.
It says may. And then the other thing is you're going to have gates too to make it really fully effective. So it means streets that have not historically had gates will have to have
There's
gates
also
as well.
there's also grading that you can put in driveways. That there are a fair number of those throughout the village. And
The rollers.
yeah,
The
exactly.
rollers are very effective.
Yeah, in lieu of a actual
A set of rollers,
For rollers. Okay.
and the deer will not, they won't go.
Right.
I don't know how everyone else, has felt about it, but that would be, I mean, certainly controlling it is important, but what will also tend to happen is I think that one person might get a fence and then their deer will go to the next yard. So then that person will have to get a fence. So I'm not sure it solves the problem. It solves the problem for one person. It doesn't necessarily solve the problem for the village.
Right.
Of course, doing nothing doesn't change the problem either.
Right.
So I understand that. So I don't know. I guess it's really that balance between control of the issue with the impact on the visual nature of lots from the
Right,
street.
right.
You know, the side lots and the rear lot, you know, fine, people can
Right.
landscape that. It's for the front
Right,
lot, the front of the lot.
Right.
But, you know, we've had this question before about hedging in the front, you know, in our board. And my question to us is like, you know, how many of our properties are actually fully landscaped and not necessarily open like, you know, our historic communities would have been in the past?
Right.
You know, I know my street, there's 4 houses on the street, 2 of them are completely hedged off.
Right,
So that's a
right.
50%.
I'm not necessarily opposed to people hedging their lot, because that's pretty traditional here.
Right.
Right.
I mean, it's certainly less traditional with the smaller lots, although it seems to be what many builders doing today.
Yeah, you
Is
know,
adding a hedge to the front.
we even drive down Elm Street and, you know,
But there are some,
without counting, I think it's 50% of Elm Street is all
Yeah,
hedged
and
off.
it used to be all open.
Exactly, yeah, when I was
Yeah,
a child, it
yeah.
was, you could run from one yard
Right,
to the other.
right.
But the community isn't like that any longer.
Right.
you know, so it would be that is whether it would actually be landscaped, A, and B, how you would deal with the gates.
Right,
And if
right.
if a grading works, I don't really know.
Yeah.
I think there's also one thing that's come up is, you know, the reason for 8 feet is 8 feet's what's required to prohibit a deer from being able to jump over. One thing that some towns have done apparently is set 6 feet on the idea that you're discouraging deer, but you are recognizing the fact that the deer are around. So it's like, it's controlled but not totally stopping it, and 6 feet creates less of a wall than 8 feet, which I think was your point before
Exactly.
hedging.
Yeah, I think, well,
Yeah.
the town, I think that the town regulation is a pretty good regulation. It limits it to 6 feet, which does not trap the deer inside the property sometimes when you come in. And I also think that to not, it's going to make everybody hedge off completely their property. And I think it's going to have a substantial impact on the streetscape and for the village. So I think 6 feet is a good compromise, and I think that the village, what should do is maybe participate. There's a lot of programs that the county has, or that the state has, the New York State DEC has, and I think that maybe we should participate more in those programs. I know there's Cornell University, upstate New York, has a very big program, and maybe we could start a program at Stony Brook, but also to control the deer, because I don't think it's something that the village alone can address.
Right.
Right.
And I don't think that to try to address 100% of the problem with the deer fence, I don't think it's the solution. I think it's something that we need to address with the surrounding communities.
Ed, you had sent an article about Hilton Head, and I guess they used a chemical culling approach.
They were actually had
Right.
hunters out in the middle of the night from, I think it was 10 p.m. to 3 a.m.
Uh-huh.
But Hilton Head is very wide open, it's full of golf courses.
Right,
So that,
right.
you know, and
Right.
relatively small lots compared
Right,
to Southampton
right.
Village.
But sterilization, which is a little bit
Right,
more humane,
right.
potentially.
You know, it's, there were issues with sterilization. I don't remember exactly what they were, but they were doing the sterilization on some of the remote islands around Hilton Head, and they were getting good reaction. But once you sterilize the deer, you can't eat the deer meat that's on that deer.
Right.
So,
Is that right?
yeah. Exactly.
What bet on
So-
there's a lot of eating of deer meat is there in the village?
Well, you don't know the random hunter that may take a deer, so there are issues with that. And I also don't think there's a
But you
there's a
can't hunt
timeline,
in the village. There's no place in the village you can hunt, is there?
not legally.
Right. So
There's
so that probably shouldn't be a problem, because we're not going to.
But
But
deer,
the deer go
are not
migrate.
really
Oh, they
aware
may
of the
go
village
beyond the village.
boundary. They're not.
Yeah, exactly. And whereas on the islands around Hilton Head
Right.
Island, they were actually, trapped on the island due to
Yeah.
water.
Right.
Although some of them
I
swam
saw
out of
that
the
they
ocean.
swim because
Do we have-
there were literally weren't deer on Shelter Island, but they
Yeah.
basically
Well,
swam across.
if you
and
reduce the
now
herd
they're-
or whatever in the village,
Yeah.
would they just keep coming in from the town?
Well, that's the other
Potential.
question. It's not clear you can, I mean, I think one of the things that's been hard for the village is it's not clear how much the village can control because the deer herds move around. I remember when this came up in 2012, someone who worked, I think, at Southampton College had done a study, and they showed how the deer followed a pattern where they would go in a circuit. around the village and around the town. They literally had a regular path they would go on.
Right.
And he was basically saying, just, you can do something in the village, but that's just going to bring in more deer. That ultimately, the deer are going to come in from the town anyway.
Correct.
Like you can't, you were saying before, you can't isolate the village as a separate item.
Exactly. And that's where the issue comes in with the,
Right.
chemically controlling them
Right.
with
Right.
birth control.
Right.
I mean, if you, I think there's probably less issues with side and rear lots. lot
Right,
lines.
correct.
But if you, and you can fence those lots for the most part anyway, right?
Yes, correct.
What-
I think the
what-
difference right now is there's no provision for fencing in front yards, and front yard fencing is fairly strictly regulated, so this would in effect be relief from that. But you couldn't do a stockade fence. This is talking about a wire fence,
Right.
right? Because stockade front fences, I think, are
4 feet tall.
only 4 feet, so they're basically meaningless. I mean, especially for deer, it's completely.
Yeah, 6 feet is meaningless for deer, I mean, quite
Yeah.
honestly.
No,
Yeah.
I think 6 feet is,
That doesn't work at all.
No.
They go over 7 feet,
Yeah.
Yeah.
and plastic doesn't work either.
No, it has to be metal.
Steel.
Yeah. 25 years ago, I saw a big buck out in East Hampton actually charge through a plastic deer fence.
Wow.
Yeah. Went in through the driveway gates, they were open, the
Right.
property was completely deer fenced.
Right.
We pulled on the property, startled the deer, he took
Right.
off across the backyard and literally head down through the plastic fence.
Well, the other thing I saw referenced in here is oceanfront properties, which, I've noticed more and more fences along the ocean that are visible from the beach. And I understand they're probably a larger problem because there's so much exposure there.
Right.
And it says something about a different, maybe not being required to have to plant or a different planting because you're in a waterfront zone, so the plantings are different. But I think that's also just of concern, just to make sure this doesn't
Right.
start to be more and more large fences.
Right.
You're sitting on the beach
Right,
and there's
there it
a,
is.
exactly.
Right.
Fencing
I think
behind
this
it.
is what's we're going to create here. We're going to create, everybody's going to be surrounding themselves, with fences, with hedges and fences, and I don't think this is what we want to do.
So they're already surrounding themselves with hedges. Whether there's fence in those hedges or not, we don't know, but
Right. There's a lot of fencing hiding in the hedges.
there are a lot of
Currently.
hedges, there are a lot of
Right.
hedges in
Right.
Southampton Village that are hiding people from people.
Right.
Right.
Well, they're also hiding deer fences.
Yes.
Right.
yes. No, and you're correct.
Right,
There are a lot tall hedges on many properties now, so
Yep.
I guess my concern was the may condition a permit for a difference on the installation of hedging.
Right.
It didn't require it. It says that it gives the authority to the building department to decide.
Yeah. That should be taken out. Like, if you're putting up the deer fence, you should
Just
screen it.
landscape it.
Exactly,
Yeah.
absolutely.
Right.
But, it comes back to the first one, can we have deer fencing
Right,
or not?
right.
Right.
You know?
Well, and certainly I think part of the issue is it's happening anyway, so we're trying to address.
Right. That is part of the issue, and I think one of the reasons the building inspector brought it up is, they go to a site and they realize there's a deer fence there, and then what do?
Right.
Because it's not permitted in the current zoning, but if, you have 12 houses on the street and 6 of them have deer fence, and is he supposed to find them all, or, what does he do about the ones that are putting in the deer fence? That's part of the problem.
Right.
And as we talked about, many of them hide them in effect, because they put in the hedge and then they put the wire
Yeah.
behind the hedge.
Yeah.
It's fairly typical, actually.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that was my main issue, is just the character on the street,
Right.
Right.
if that can be
Right.
I
addressed.
share that same concern.
Yeah. I think, and again, I do understand, and that's, I guess, where the balance is. A hedge along the street that's 8 feet high is a pretty significant wall on the street. You can't see over it. 6-foot fence, 6-foot hedge, you actually can see over. Most people can see over it. 8-foot, you cannot.
Right.
So it does have a dramatic visual impact. I think that's been the issue. And that's why I think I think I mentioned in the original email, I think a number of towns originally went to 8 and then switched to 6
That's right.
when they saw the visual impact of of a street of 8-foot hedges. You know, the estate section's a little different if you have 8-foot hedges.
Right.
If you do it on a smaller street, I think it's fairly dramatic.
So would one conceivably talk about the different height for per zone?
Potentially, that is one way to look at it, yeah.
What is the regulation in Southampton Town? Or do you know that?
Well, it's 6 feet, and you need a permit for any fence.
So you're allowed to do it in Southampton Town with a permit? except for
With a
6 feet?
permit, yes, but 6 feet high. They do not allow anymore. And there, Marty Shea was a very, very well-renowned, very knowledgeable environmentalist, really believes that, there's a balance between human needs and, nature. And, they are part of the nature in this area. Now, the fact that the population has jumped so much is another issue that doesn't necessarily need to be dealt with through the fence.
And some of it is it's jumped, and some of it is they've been forced out of a lot of their traditional
Exactly.
areas.
That's exactly
I mean,
right.
the obvious example in the village is Wickapog.
Right.
Wickapog 20 years ago was basically clear all the way from Old Town to Fowler. Now it's mostly hedged yards, and so I think a lot of that's been pushed out. A lot of it gets pushed out then into the rest of the village.
Right. Also, 20 years ago, there were a lot more hunters out here.
Correct. Right.
They
correct.
actually...
Right. It used to be in the fall you would hear that pretty constantly.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But, even some of the hardcore hunters out in Watermill that were farmers,
Right.
they got tired of shooting deer and put up deer fence.
Right.
Just, it was becoming a full-time job.
Right. Yeah.
And
There's
how
so
much,
many,
and how
yeah.
much venison
Yeah,
can
That's
it be?
interesting because on the farmland, which we don't have very much in the village,
Right.
obviously there are people putting taller than
Oh, yeah,
8-foot deer fence up.
Well, I did notice the Fowler family. I guess about half their farmland is within the village. They've put up deer fencing now
Right.
around their fields. Yeah, so it's definitely happening.
Is there a different regulation for agricultural land?
Yes.
There is.
In the
Yeah.
town there is.
Yeah. Yeah,
They are exempt.
from the fence rule.
Yeah, you still have to get a permit, but
You
Right.
still have to get a permit, but they can put up whatever they want. That much.
Right.
yes.
Right. Comments from the audience?
Hi,
And please identify yourself.
Evelyn Conrad, 18 South Roscoe Drive in Deerland.
Right.
We elect local, state, and federal government to take care of those things that are not cost-effective for individual residents or citizens to take care of, or not as efficient, and deer are certainly that. These are a problem of environment and health, and it's both. It's really severe. They're even getting into the privet now. So I will tell you in a second what I think is wrong with the fences as conceived at this point, because first of all, I don't think they'll work. I don't think you'll get the local residents. Do you have any idea what it costs to take care of 8-foot hedges? It's immense. The 500 permit is also a little ridiculous. We're driving out enough of our local citizens, I think, to start thinking. I would suggest, but I think that's sort of something we might discuss other than at a great public meeting, that our village attorney should send a mandamus, or the beginning of a mandamus, to the state environmental, DEC, and to the health department, stating that it's an acute problem that cannot be solved on the village level, and that we insist that the government does its job of getting everybody together and taking these deer to a nature preserve. They are crippled. They were at Mashomak years ago. We used to go there. They were crippled because they didn't get enough to eat, and there was no culling. So you're not doing a kindness to the herd. You're certainly not doing a kindness to me or the rest of us who live here with facing them all the time. So I think there's a desperate need for a government job to be done, and I think the village attorney should be capable of doing that. It's an environmental problem, a major one, and it's a major health problem. Now, as for the fence, plastic does not work. Steel fencing is extremely expensive, but it is effective. If it's 8 feet tall, 6 feet does nothing. The deer jump 7 feet. My guess is as they become hungrier, they'll manage 8 feet, but 8 feet is adequate. Again, I say you're imposing a horrendous responsibility on the local residents, especially in the little village streets. You'll also be facing green walls. It is the opposite of what Southampton used to be when I got here in '58, open lawns and so on. Furthermore, the fence law is directly in violation of 11616, which is the corner clearance law. And I've only just gotten through a 6-month fight to get 58 South Roscoe take down a 6-foot stockade fence, which was a terrible problem. And there are many, many hedges in our Roscoe area that are just 6 foot, that are in violation of the 11616, the corner clearance. There is a big problem in our neighborhood 10 years ago. Maybe that's when the fence was put up. There were no SUVs racing down. There are SUVs racing down the area now. And I think as you consider this fence law, please consider the immense extent of the unintended consequences, which will be huge. And I don't think the problem will be solved. I do think it takes, as you were saying too, at least the unit of Long Island can be taken as one. If we can't get the state to do something, God knows the federal government's not going to do anything.
Other comments? Yes.
Hello. Hi, I'm Candace Post. Am I supposed to say where I live? 420 Hill Street. To me, this is sort of a health and an aesthetic issue. As far as hedges on, tall hedges on the streets, there are so many wonderful, beautiful privet hedges all over Southampton, and some of them are quite tall, higher than 8 feet. And actually, the Hamptons, I hate to say that word, sort of known for privet. There have been books written about privet, and I think privet is very attractive. I'm wondering if perhaps, if in the smaller lots, in the smaller part of town, perhaps fences could be, 8-foot tall fences could be placed from the houses to the side yard. Possibly then the deer wouldn't be able to get at least into the backyard. If 8 foot is objectionable in the front, I don't think it is. I mean, I've seen so many beautiful, really tall hedges around town, and I actually admire them. But I do feel that this is really a health issue. And personally, I've now been bitten twice this year and once last year, just in my backyard, just gardening. I've tried to keep them out. I have 6-foot fencing around most of my property and 7-foot tall sort of netting, all to no avail. You know, they go under it, they go over it. 7 feet, certainly not tall enough, and 6, for sure, is not going to deter them at all. So I'm in favor of the 8 feet tall. And and just one other thing. So a lot of people have beautiful gates. As we drive around town, we see all the beautiful gates. Rather expensive. And unfortunately, maybe they've been there for years, and now all of a sudden we have so many deer that now people are putting like little spikes, up, or some netting that is sort of jerry-rigged onto them. It's really such a shame to spend all that money and then still have the problem with deer. So hopefully we can come up with something that, is aesthetically pleasing and keep us safe from the deer population. Thank you.
Other comments?
Can I speak from here, or you want me up? No.
You have to go up.
Okay, I'm going to go.
I have a hard taskmaster.
A couple of pieces of paper.
Okay.
My name is Franklin Treader, and I'm a condo unit owner in Whitefield, and we're very much in favor. I want to say a few things. I noticed that there's a recent letter from the building inspector dated July 3, 2018, that's not among the documents that you're distributing. Okay. That was delivered on July 3, I think, to maybe you, but certainly, well,
Not that I'm aware of.
okay.
It's possible, I guess.
I only have one copy of it that I picked up, but we might stop for a minute, or maybe someone could copy it. It went to you, to the mayor, and to the trustees. If you could read it, I could read it out loud.
I'll read it out loud.
Okay, that'd be good.
Yeah, thank you. I haven't seen this, but thank you for...
No, I'm not far be it from me to accuse you of anything.
So let me, do you want me to read it now?
It would be helpful.
Sure. Okay, so this is a letter from John Forster to the Southampton Village Planning Commission dated July 3rd, I guess, Tuesday. I write to you in support of the proposed local law adding a new subsection D with respect to the deer fence, amending section 11618, and in response to your letter of June 24, 2018 to the Mayor and Board of Trustees of the Village of Southampton. And that letter is available here for anyone who wants to see it. First, your letter expressed concern as to 8-foot wire, like mesh in front yards, resulting in dramatic change to the architectural aesthetic of the majority of the village. The proposal law conditions a permit, your point, for a deer fence on the simultaneous installation of hedging and/or plantings, the height of the deer fence to conceal the fencing's visual impact to the street or adjacent property. Such hedging or plantings have long been an integral part of the aesthetic of the village and not a dramatic change. Also, the proposed local law prohibits the approval of the installation of deer fencing, which would cause safety risks to vehicular or pedestrian traffic on any nearby or adjacent roadway. Second, your letter suggests there maybe need to be further study of whether deer fence should be 6 or 8 foot in height. My letter, this is John Forster's letter of April 10th that you referenced, enclosed a copy of an email from the Cornell Extension Office in Riverhead, which furnished links to 5 extensive authoritative studies of how high deer can jump and the height and type of fencing that is required to keep out deer. I said in my letter, the authorities who have studied deer fencing are unanimous in their opinion that a deer fence must be at least 8 foot in height to fully exclude deer. Following excerpts from the Cornell list, the first from the North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission and the second from the Cornell Cooperative Extension publication are typical. First, quote, an adult deer can easily jump 7 feet or higher. A deer-proof fence would need to be 8 feet or taller. And the second quote is, if deer must be kept out entirely, this 8-foot dimension is the only reliable method. Fences reaching 5, 6, or even 7 feet high are useful deterrents, but do not always provide complete exclusion. I strongly urge the Planning Commission at its meeting of July 5th to recommend to the trustees the enactment of the proposed subsection D with respect to the deer fence at their meeting on July 12th, 2018. And he also attached a copy of a Wall Street Journal article, which some of you may have seen on Monday, Long Islanders seek shelter from ticks.
There's a postscript there, you might as well, if you want.
That's the postscript.
There's a text to the postscript, right there where your hand is.
Yeah, the journal piece says the Lyme disease is spread by deer ticks and is the most common type of tick-borne illness. It goes on to say that according to locals, the deer population has skyrocketed. The public health, safety, and welfare issues need to be addressed by the enactment of the 8-foot deer fence amendment. Okay.
So that's my only copy, but
I'll get the building department to send a copy, I guess they forgot.
Okay, thank you. So I appreciate that. First of all, on the question that's been raised, it's a reasonable point. If you look at the legislation, subparagraph C on page 2, it's somewhat inconsistent because the first sentence says the building department may, and I think that's the point
Right.
that you were making.
Yeah.
But the second sentence says, hedging and planting shall be installed simultaneously. So I don't think it's unreasonable to ask the village attorney
Right.
to just make it clear. The building department assumes that it's mandatory. I assumed that it was mandatory, but I see that it does say may in one sentence and says shall in another sentence. Another thing that's been discussed, and I'll get back to what I wanted to say, but is gates. Under the existing law before this proposal, 8-foot gates may have them as of right for any fences, whether they're deer fences or any, but the gate is subject to an application to the Architectural Review Board, so that is taken care of. So that, as I read that letter that you just read, the comments that were made to the trustees in your letter were certainly reasonable if you didn't look at the statute. But the statute was specifically written, and we'll assume for a moment, to make hedges required to screen the wire fences so you wouldn't see them. And it takes care of traffic and problems with corners and everything that you mentioned. The building department will not approve anything. So those comments were both taken care of by the statute itself. I'm going to talk a moment about 6 and 8 feet, but I wanted to make sure that I covered. I think the suggestion about the legislation and the state is fine, but it's going to take years to get this done. This law is not a mandatory law. It doesn't require people to install deer fences. It's a voluntary law to permit people like Whitefield and other homeowners. I've been here for 32 years, but not in Whitefield, 4 years, so I've been paying taxes and enjoying it for a long time. And you can have a deer fence if you want one. You don't have to have a deer fence if you don't want one. So you don't have to spend the money for hedges. And if you're happy with what's happening, then that's it. So we shouldn't read this as if we're compelling anyone to do that. So now I just want to make a couple of points as it relates to Whitefield, and I think relates to the village as a whole. I think it's pretty well known that the Whitefield was originally the Breeze Estate, and it was designed by the famous and infamous architect Stanford White, who there's a book just came out, and he was murdered, and the whole thing is very, very interesting. And the main building of the estate is now the main building of Whitefield, and that's part of the condominium. It's not as well known as that the landscaping at Whitefield was designed by the Olmsted brothers, who designed Central Park in Manhattan and Prospect Park in Brooklyn. And so the landscaping at Whitefield was at one time, it wasn't an official landmark, but it was as startling as the house. But Whitefield, the state had a history. It was, I think, given to Amherst College, and then it became a boys' school, and then so there's no saying that the landscaping there was the way the Olmsteds left it. But the landscaping at Whitefield has been completely demolished by the deer. And whatever we have is just as high as the deer can reach. It's all bare, and then the landscaping is above it. Besides that, the owners, it's 29 units. I think it's 4 or 5 in the main house. The rest of them are around in a circle. And they have little backyards, and they have, and we have in our place, try to plant things, and then the deer just demolish it. The second point, so we know that the landscape, and I think anyone in the village will be complaining about it. Maybe you're complaining about it, I don't know. The second point we talked about is health and Lyme disease and ticks, which the Wall Street Journal article, but we don't really need the Wall Street Journal article for that. It's a serious health problem to landscapers and to children. The third problem is that the deer are dangerous. My wife was driving back from the village on November 13, 2017. We have 2 entrances to Whitefield, so she was coming in the east entrance. There's a set of mailboxes. She was about 50 feet in that driveway when a deer jumped over from the village latch, the 6-foot fence, and just missed our car. And nobody got hurt, and the car didn't get hurt. And then management at Whitefield sent out a notice to everybody that you better drive carefully, just even on our own driveway, because the deer are jumping.
Right.
So you got those three things. You got the landscaping, you got the health problem, and it's a serious problem. Now I want to talk for a moment about the 6 or 8 foot option, as if it were an option. And the comment here was right on. When Whitefield started to consider this, we have a 6 foot fence, a deer fence in Whitefield, which is useless, but it's a good example. If anybody, this board or anybody, would go over there and look at the 6 foot fence, it's in the hedges and it's literally invisible. So there's no prohibition, as I understand it, in the village code for the height of hedges. So you can have an 8 foot, 10 foot hedges, the other person mentioned, and that's perfectly legal, and they're all over the place. So having voluntarily on your own property conditioned an 8 foot wire fence on having 8 foot hedges, it's true, it costs money, but you don't have to do it if you don't want to. So I got in touch. I was going to say that when we were doing it at Whitefield, if you talk to a landscaper, any local person who knows anything about it would say, you've got to have an 8 foot fence. But it's hearsay. So I had an idea. I went to Cornell University. So I called up the Cornell Extension Office in Riverhead, and it was a good conversation. They didn't care whether I went to Cornell or not. And about 2 hours after the phone call, they sent me studies that just dropped my pen, but I'll get it. I just want to show you. I don't expect you to read them. But these studies were first made available to Whitefield, then they were made available to the trustees. And you had John Forster's letter, not the most recent one,
Right.
but the original one.
Right.
And that letter referenced the study from Cornell. And I want to just show you, I don't expect you to read them, what we're talking about the detailed studies that have already been done in the world and are now before all these bodies. The first one is called Managing White-tailed Deer in Suburban Environments, and it was put out by the Cornell Cooperative Extension and the Wildlife Society and the Northeast Wildlife Damage Organization. I'm having trouble with that papers. The second one is another study, Internet Center for Wildlife Damage Management, Cornell University, Clemson University, University of Nebraska, Lincoln and Utah State University. The third one, bear with me for a moment, is the North Carolina Wildlife Resource Fences to Exclude Deer. And the next one was the University of Vermont Extension Department of Plant and Social Science, the Green Mountain Gardner Effective Deer Fencing. These are summarized in the excerpt that you read,
Right.
which I want to repeat, which says that an adult deer can easily jump 7 feet or higher. A deer-proof fence would need to be 8 feet or taller. If deer must be kept out entirely, this 8-foot dimension is the only reliable method. Fences reaching 5, 6, or 7 feet high are useful deterrents, but do not always provide.
Right, I think that footnote, inadvertently or not, talks to the issue we're talking about here, which is, do you want, I don't think anyone's arguing that a deer fence needs to be 8 feet to totally exclude deer.
I agree with that.
I think everyone agrees with that. I think that's fact.
Okay.
The issue is, however, the footnote also says that a 6 or 7 foot fence is a deterrent. It doesn't
One
exclude
of
them,
the
but it's a
articles,
deterrent.
yeah.
And it's been mentioned elsewhere. And that issue of whether in an environment where the deer are never going to disappear, the issue is it more effective to try to exclude them or to deter them? And one thing I would comment on is, I know the theory that no one's being forced to build a deer fence, but if you have 11 houses on a block and 10 put in a deer fence, you're going to have no choice, because every single deer is going to end up at your property. So it's a distinction without a difference. Everybody will end up with a deer fence eventually. So I'm not saying that's a bad thing. I'm just saying the idea that it's voluntary is in theory true, but will not be true in
What
practice.
you're doing is you're not permitting, I'm sorry, you
In
want to
case
say?
of Whitefield, you still have your driveways, you don't have gates.
No, we want to talk about the gates. We're looking into gates.
You're looking at the gates now.
When they put up a 6-foot fence, I was opposed to that because I knew it was 8 foot. We're waiting, now the board there, I don't want to speak for them, I'm not on the board, but they have come around to know what you just said, that 8 feet is necessary. So they're waiting for this to be passed anxiously. They want to spend somewhere like $300,000 for gates. It would be crazy to spend $300,000 for gates and have a 6-foot fence, because they're jumping over like in the rodeo.
Right, but Whitefield is a very large area, and if you suddenly completely fence yourself off with an 8-foot fence, it's going to impact the surrounding properties.
Well, it'll impact
And
this.
that's the idea, is that do we want to try to create a middle ground where we are deterring it, and then we also take action with the state. We're trying to find other solutions to reduce the population, and yet, so we are addressing the problem on multiple fronts, rather than try to really fence ourselves off.
Right, but you're making a man, all your solutions are wonderful, but meanwhile, we have that problem, and other owners have the problem. When I owned a house, I had the problem. So what you're doing is, by using and looking into other solutions, which are wonderful, and those cattle things don't work, and animals fall in there and die, and they're ugly. What you're doing is you're prohibiting people from having a deer fence by saying, let's wait while we shoot them, or we do this. You could do all those.
There was 6-foot fence.
But a 6-foot fence doesn't work, as the chairman just
It's not
said.
useless. Let me just, I want to be very careful about the language here. A 6-foot fence is a deterrent. It doesn't exclude.
Well, it wasn't a deterrent at 18 South Roscoe.
Well, deterrent means
It's all the
deterrent.
neighbors
I think if you look at, I'll pretend I'm President Trump for a minute, and I actually I know what words mean. A deterrent means it works, but it doesn't always work, right? And I have a 6-foot fence, and I agree with you. It doesn't stop deer in every case, but it has lowered the incidence. So, but I'm not saying that's right or wrong. A deterrent is different than exclusion.
I'll give you the word
Right.
deterrent.
Right.
So you have 2 deer jumping a
Right.
6-foot fence
Right.
instead of 3.
Right. Correct. That's right. That's
You
right.
still have deer in your yard.
Correct.
eating your
I
bugs.
totally agree with you. That's the issue.
And when I showed you 5 amazing studies that they exist in the world, surprised me. What studies do you have
No,
that a 6-foot fence is a deterrent?
No, I just read
They
your
say,
footnote again.
that's not a footnote, it's an excerpt from there. It says it may be a deterrent,
They
but
are.
if you want to stop deer, you got to have an 8-foot
There's
fence.
a reason why, and again, I'm not saying I'm opposed to 8-foot fence. I'm just trying to lay out the issues as carefully as I can. Right.
And against you, though, sir, I forget your name, I apologize.
Frank Fetter.
Frank.
I forget my name sometimes.
In the studies that we've read, and in the studies you have in front of you, I'm sure if you read them again, you will find 6-foot and 7-foot, 5-foot fences are deterrents.
Right.
But like we just said,
Right.
you'll have 2 instead of 3.
Right.
It's not going to keep them all out. And I agree with you. I want to see 8-foot deer fences
Right.
allowed in the village of
But
Southampton.
in all this, and I appreciate you giving me more time than usually happens. You're using the phrase deterrent, let's not get into Donald Trump for a minute, as if we're passing a law to stop the deer. What we're doing is passing a law to permit people to build a fence with hedges so that you can't see the fence, and with traffic studies so it doesn't harm you. It's a permissive thing. And what you're doing is I want, when we were in Halsey Neck Lane across from Boatsman,
Right.
my wife had a lot of roses, and the deer were eating the roses.
Right.
Now I have to make a confession. I think the statute of limitations has run. We had constructed, I don't have those abilities, an 8-foot deer fence
Right, right.
without the permission of the building department. And Whitefield can't do that. They're a good citizen.
Right.
They're waiting for something to happen. When we did that, we had no deer at all. When we sold our house, it's since been knocked down, somebody came from Sag Harbor with a truck and took all the rose plants away and to plant them elsewhere because they were all protected by the deer fence. And if you came to our Whitefield now, you won't be able to see the deer fence because it's a 6-foot fence. So I'm going to leave you with the idea that there's a difference between permitting people to do this and what's the best way to stop it. Let's not move them around. Even though Whitefield is a large expanse, it's not moving deer to the village latch. The village latch deer are jumping over our
Right,
property.
and I just, the traffic notion, it sounds nice. I think, I don't even know how to discuss it. There's no way to analyze traffic. I mean, if you fence off, unless you think deer are going to magically disappear, which I think is unlikely in the East End, when you hedge things at 8 feet, where do the deer go?
To the neighbor,
To the street.
to the neighbor,
And to the street.
and to the street.
And to the street,
So I
right?
thought you were worried about
You
cars.
have a hungry deer.
Right,
You have
right.
a hungry deer because they're,
That's
more
right.
violent
Right,
deer.
right,
because
right.
They're going to be looking for it.
I think,
So-
all I'm saying, look, I think there's a careful balance, and this is a very hard issue. On the one hand, you're absolutely right. Without an 8-foot fence, you're not going to be able to slew deer. People come here because they want a landscape. They have the right to privacy and to control their house.
Right.
On the other hand, you know, we have some responsibility to try to represent the village as a whole. I think my guess is we're going to be back here in a few years talking about the problem we've met, which is what's happened, by the way, in other towns that have passed an 8-foot law, is they've come back and changed the law.
To a
Because what
9-foot.
they found to 6 foot,
What
to
town?
6 feet.
Oh, really?
East Hampton.
In East Hampton, yes.
Right, it's now 6 feet.
You're creating, we don't want
You
to
create another problem, which is now the deer are pushed into whatever houses don't have fence, or they're pushed
even
into
more
the streets.
aggressively.
Or they're
That's why
pushed
we
in,
made a
right.
mistake.
But the deer, unless you can make the deer disappear,
Yes.
and can't,
Yes.
which at least is not going to happen in the short term, let's just say that.
You've been
That's
told-
the
I
balance.
want to
That's
leave
all
you
hard.
alone, but on the traffic, the idea was
Right.
the building inspector is given the authority not to approve. If you put up a fence, forget deer fence, if you put up a fence
Right.
and you can make a determination, you have to submit drawings, you got to do all kinds of stuff, that this is blocked because of the nature of where this property is, cars coming can't see or whatever.
Right.
It won't be approved. That's
right.
what's here.
But that's not really traffic. What that's saying is, which is similar to the corner law that someone
That's
brought
law
up.
1660.
Right, is that you should not do a fence that blocks vision.
Right.
Right, that's not traffic control, that's called vision.
Okay, so I used the wrong,
Right,
I
right.
used the wrong word.
No, you didn't. I think the building
Okay, so-
inspector did, honestly. It's just
Right,
not
but-
traffic control, it's vision.
All right, so.
You want to make sure the cars don't crash into each other because of the fence, obviously,
But
but it's not managing
you're giving the
traffic
building
impact.
department in this statute discretion not to approve an application that vision will cause
Correct.
danger.
Correct.
It's in there.
Right.
And the same thing with the may and the shall, which is
Right.
a good point, if it said shall. Otherwise, you're just not letting anybody do such a thing.
Right.
And it's not for everybody, it's only for somebody who wants to do it.
Right, and your point before, which is the point the building inspector is making, which is a very important point, is people are doing it anyway.
Oh, yes.
Whether or not it's permitted, people are doing
They're
it.
all over.
Right, right.
And they're doing it,
Right.
and it works. And it's not pushing deer everywhere else. Not everybody wants it. Some people don't care. So thank you very much.
Well, I mean, it does sound like 6 foot is not going to be a total solution.
Right.
So I don't know if the visual impact between 6 and 8 is how substantial an impact that is, if you're going to do it.
It is. I mean, just think about if you're say, you're 5.5 feet, a 6-foot hedge you can actually see over. An 8-foot hedge you cannot see over. No one can see over. And in fact, you can't even see the ground floor of a house. Right? So the reason that 6 versus 8 has been reasonably controversial in most towns is because visually it's very different. Now, you're right, we have hedges in this town that are 14 feet.
And there's nothing in the code that prohibits that.
Yes,
Well, yeah, there is actually.
Yes, there is.
It's not enforced, but there is.
For hedges?
Yeah.
That's amazing.
Yeah, I know you wouldn't know, and I'm not sure it should be in the code, but it is in the code.
Because
So,
you're all around,
yeah.
there's hedges for 8, 10
So then the other thing, which we haven't really discussed in much depth, and I'm interested that the cattle things don't work. It seemed to me like they could jump over them. But the gates, they can't. Oh, if they work that.
Well, again, there's dimensions to them that you
There's
need
not
the
a lot of
dimensions.
text in here about the gates. It just says that
No,
you can't
because
have
the
an
gates are
electric.
as of right. The regular law, this is a new amendment.
Right.
The section that is amending to add the deer fence. Gates, for any kind of gate, a picket fence, whatever you want, 8 feet as of right, subject to the approval of the Architectural Review Board.
Well, that's was my point. Are gates just within the historic district subject to
No,
ARB?
all gates.
All gates.
Yeah.
So that
If
remains.
you look at their agenda, about half of it is gates.
Right. Well, I've heard
Yeah.
them complain about.
Which they complain endlessly about. It. This is going to make it much worse for them.
But that was just my question: is how do
Right.
we? Is this going to create any issue? with
Right.
this-
No, that remains. This is an amendment to a statute
Yeah,
that
no,
has
just thinking of-
8-foot gates, subject to that approval.
Right.
So
Okay. It doesn't reference that in
But
the
the
statute.
fact that the hedges are violating and that the deer fence is existing, all uncontrolled, certainly would seem a wise thing to control them now and then worry about it later. We shouldn't have all these different
And I have one other question. I don't know who is the biggest deer fence expert here, but I know someone who has put 2 lower gates spaced apart.
Very good.
Does that work?
Yeah, if you, and I'm not an expert, I just had to have, I'm a retired lawyer. I did litigation and construction business. We called an expert, a guy 50 miles from home. If you show up and you're not local, you're an expert. Yes, they're in these things. They're not that far apart, but if you have 2 6-foot fences, as I understand it, you put little ribbons on them so the deer is aware of it. And let's say they're going to be, I say, 2 or 3 feet apart. The deer will not, as I understand it, jump over 2 6-foot parallel fences.
Right.
And I've seen even lower than 6 feet on 2 parallel.
I don't
Because-
know, I know that.
Because my only other concern in here is the lots with the oceanfront lots. It's just, there's no requirement to have vegetation, which sort of makes sense because why plant a giant 8-foot hedge? But you are going
It's
to
going
have,
to die anyway.
it's going to die anyway.
Right, basically. Right, they're not going to, hedge is not going to survive along the ocean.
Maybe in those instances, the 2 shorter parallel fences might, because usually there's more
Right.
space in those
Correct.
instances.
Before we did our deer fence, I saw a deer from a standing start. We had an interior fence, just a decorative fence, standing, not running, jumped 6 feet, went right over. And the head of our condominium, the president's son, came with a dog, and the dog chased the deer, and the deer jumped the other way 6 feet easily. So that-
I had the opposite experience. Deer got in, could not figure out how to get out. I had to basically guide him how to get out. They're not all that smart.
No, but we have at Whitefield, besides the front,
Right.
those gates, we have a gate at the back where
Right.
it meets the village line. And if a deer is stuck in there,
Right.
they just open the gate
Right.
and they herd them out. So we have a method of handling that problem.
Yeah. Other public comment? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Eric Winkler. I live on John Street, which is kind of the heart of the village. And first of all, I appreciate that you're taking up that issue, but I'd really like to emphasize you're discussing a partial solution to a problem that shouldn't exist. What that means is there are too many deer in the village. I think it's an obvious fact, but I just want to emphasize that again. And the fence alone will not solve the problem. And you really have to encourage you to make this a comprehensive or multi-pronged approach to really get to the bottom of it. I mean, you mentioned before, we've been here 5 years ago.
Right.
We'll be here 5 years ago again. I hope not. I mean, step back and ask yourself, what have you done, or the village, I'm not saying you per se, but you're part of the whole administration here and governance, what has been done except that the problem got worse?
Right.
So it's clearly an emotional issue somewhat, and there are pros and cons on both sides. And there were a couple of articles in Southampton Press, and I was quoted in one of them, and a lot of people approached me afterwards. And I'm surprised the level of anger and frustration there is in the village in particular about this issue. Mm-hmm. And I think something really needs to be done. I also feel, although a couple of studies were quoted here tonight, this is being discussed without a lot of facts. Facts about how many deer are there. Are there more of them than there were 5-10 years ago?
Yeah. There was a study done, which I think I agree with you very strongly. There was a study done several years ago that actually tracked, there was a census of all the deer in the village.
That's a great one to get.
It's great, and it's one of the things it did was talk about they all follow a certain pattern, and that the pattern was getting altered by the amount of development of vacant lots. And a lot of what we perceive as a growing problem, the study was basically saying was not actually more deer, it's they're getting forced out of the areas they were in. So we talked about before, there were, we talked about Wickapog Lane before. That's a really good example, which is that was mostly farm field and open space. Most of the open space and farm field has been taken away. Those deer had to go somewhere. So part of what the study said, this was I think 4 or 5 years ago, I think in 2012 actually, one of the reasons why the law never happened was the study basically said, you think there's more deer, it's actually the same population getting pushed around and becoming more evident as they get pushed around. And there was a census. He did a census over, I think, a year to look at the deer pattern, and actually there was a very strong talk at the time about allowing hunting. Right. To cull, which is the reason the study was done. But basically, and that's my concern, because I agree the 8-foot will have a big impact and would help. The problem that he talked about at the time was if the deer have a pattern, they literally follow a map in their minds, very much like birds follow a map. They follow a map. If you put an 8-foot hedge up, they change their map. They don't disappear. And I think people in this room are thinking they're just going to disappear. It's going to be fine. And I understand everyone's feeling in this country is now just make it someone else's problem. But still, the problem will exist if we hedge off this lot. They're going to go to the next lot because they're following their map. So so it's a very complicated problem, and I'm not opposed necessarily to the 8 feet. I just want people here to be realistic, because I think a lot of people think we're going to walk away, we're going to do 8 feet, and the deer problem's just going to magically vanish. And then when your wife hits a deer on Hill Street, she's like, where did that deer come from? And the answer is, well, it used to be a Whitefield.
Not on Hill Street, in Whitefield.
Yeah.
Right, but you understand my point.
Yeah.
That deer is not going to disappear because we hedged off Whitefield. It's going to go to the next lot. And I know that's not your problem, but we are the planning commission for the entire village.
But
totally.
I think that Eric has a great point about gathering more facts.
Right.
And I think that to get the more facts is, I think, it's very important before we jump into creating a regulation that may actually create another problem.
If deer were an endangered species, which they are not,
Right, I doubt
they
it.
would be counted every year.
Right.
You know.
Well, some people do. North Haven counts them every year
Well, I think
because they've had such a severe problem.
kind
And
of
North Haven has allowed hunting a few times.
gets back to the facts. I don't think I don't believe we have a handle of the economic cost of deer in terms of accidents, in terms of illnesses, in terms of all the fencing. I spend hundreds of dollars every year on deer repellent, deer resistant plants, and kind of this kind of a fencing and that, and bought a video camera the other day just to see that they come at 11 o'clock, at 1 o'clock, anytime. One fact I can tell you, I've been in the village in the heart of the village on John Street for 28 years. Until 5 years ago, there haven't been any deer in that part of the village. And there shouldn't be. That is not their natural habitat. So with respect to this fencing, which...
That's exactly to the point. It's that
Right.
It's not the natural habitat, and now they are coming, and they are coming to this area because they are preventing...
So I don't want to overdo it, but just the natural thing is if you hedge everyone on Elm Street, they're going to end up on John Street. They're not going to disappear from the village.
Well, the solution is
That's the
they have to be
problem.
culled.
Right.
They clearly have to be culled. I mean, if not eliminated from certain parts. I mean, they're fairly adaptable, so they become accustomed. When I grew up, when we went hiking in the woods, if you saw a deer, that was like a highlight of the trip. But they ran away as soon they usually see people before. Now they don't. So I'd just like to make a few other points that for you to consider. I mean, one is. You say they've been pushed around from the big estates and whatnot. So either we can't have it both ways. Either limit the number of buildings that can be built in the backyards in the town, so that they're not pushed into the village. I think you should try to get some CPF funding to really have a deer management plan, a more comprehensive plan, and in fact. Based data gathering so there can be some informed decision being made, because having a fence is not going to solve the problem unless you do other things. It's just going to push it around a little bit and pretends like you acted on something, but you haven't really solved the problem. In terms of the design, the aesthetics, a few things to consider. I don't totally understand why you separate between a deer fence and another fence. I mean, let other type of fencing be allowed to be 8 feet that is attractive, as opposed to, just the ugly deer fencing. For example.
You need a steel fence for the deer. You need a steel fence.
I'd be happy to have another one for starters. The other thing, maybe have them set back a little bit, not in the front of the property line. I believe you don't have any regulations how high privet can be or other plantings in the front. And it's unfortunate. I've been here, as I said, almost 30 years. I want to have an open garden so people can see it, but a lot of people have given up, and I'm close to it.
Right.
And I hope it doesn't get to it. So if you talk about aesthetics, you have to think also, what about all the people who don't have plantings anymore, or just put up privet? That's not very attractive either. So that's the other thing. I think introduce predators besides SUVs. Have some natural predators. We didn't even have rabbits until 5 years ago or 7 years ago. And now. I'm sure you know how many we have, right?
Yeah. The rabbits go in cycles against fox. So there's no fox right now, so the rabbits are up. In a few years, the fox will be back, the rabbits will be down. There's a natural cycle to the...
Good, let's try.
There's nothing for the
deer,
Let's
let the pendulum swing back, right?
You don't want the predators for the deer. Let loose
Introducing lions or something, it's not going to do much.
In terms of traffic safety, I mean, you talk about the fence might be a traffic risk.
Right.
The deer are a traffic risk, a huge one. And if you're not comfortable with having 8-foot fences for a period of time, put a limit on it. 3 years or 5 years, while other actions are being taken, and then we can see, we can all take the fence down again. We talk about, our 6 or 8 feet fence is fine. They're a deterrent. It's like deer-resistant plants.
Right.
every year there are less deer-resistant plants available, you know. So, yeah, finally, I just really encourage you to do something and don't behave like a deer caught in the headlights.
Thank you. So let me see if I can summarize, because the trustees did ask us to respond, and I think we should. So I'm not hearing any opposition on the commission to having a deer fence law. I think we all think it's a good idea, sounds like. I think there are questions that I would say maybe needs some further study. And I also think what I'm hearing is, in terms of rear and side yard, none of us feel uncomfortable with the 8-foot rule. I think it's really a question of the front yard, to the extent that some of us have some concern about the height and type of fencing and landscaping. And could we reasonably say that should be further studied? And then I think the other thing that came out of this is everyone feels in different ways. We all need to be clear that the fence law alone is not going to answer the deer issue, whether it's culling, or whatever, and actually studying the deer sounds like a really good idea, so we all understand what's going on.
I'm a lawyer, sue the state.
Well,
They'll pay attention.
And get other,
All the money that
and
will cost us to put up the deer fencing.
get, okay, and get.
We'll get faster action.
And get other governments to pay attention. I thought one fascinating idea, and I'm not sure we can do it in our code, but it is a very interesting idea, is could you pass this with a sunset? So that you could look back and say, where are we now that we've allowed this? Has it answered the deer issue?
Right.
Because one thing I am somewhat sensitive to is other towns that started with a stricter rule have ended up with less strict rules because they're finding it's just pushing the problem around.
Right.
And so one neighbor gets very happy and then the next neighbor is really unhappy. So I'm just a little bit sensitive to that. So I guess, could we pass a resolution that said we're in favor of the deer fence law, and that we think in terms of front yards it needs further study to deal with the visual impact? Is that something everyone would be comfortable with?
I would even recommend for the trustees to spend a little bit of money in hiring some environmental
Right,
consultants
okay.
who could then,
I agree.
really bring us
Right.
facts about the deer, about
Right.
at
I don't
every
think we need a
level.
lot of facts. We know there's a deer problem. I think the question is, what are the limitations to culling and hunting?
Correct,
There
correct.
must be, I don't know
Right.
why there's not more of it. There
Also
must be a reason.
I think there's just little signs to it. I mean, when you look on the web,
I don't think we need to study the deer. We know that there's a deer problem.
Right, I think that's what Mark
It's
meant.
more like
Right.
what's the effective method?
Yeah, what have other towns done that's worked?
Exactly, what
Nature
other
reserves.
solutions?
Culling is only a partial solution. Move them to nature reserves. Otherwise, it's like the 6-foot fence. It deters, it doesn't do much.
I don't.
But we might, to your point, like there was a study
That's
done of the population, so we could take that and say, here's the study, and then really the discussion should be what is the effective means of
Right.
culling, hunting, or moving.
Or moving. I mean, the moving.
Whatever, I don't know.
Moving
I'm
could
not-
certainly be also a solution.
Right, right.
Because you take them, send them to Arkansas.
Because I do, what will happen, this law will increase the problem for those who don't have a fence.
Right.
So it's only moving the problem around.
Right.
This will solve the problem for those who wish, which I'm not opposed to,
Right, right.
those who want to do it, but
Right.
it's not going to solve the problem.
Correct.
I think we're all in agreement on that. Like,
Yeah.
Right.
deer fence is step one to protect your property.
Yeah.
Step two is some form of culling.
Right.
And with that, inventory, like how many deer do we have today? How many?
Right, and
were there
look, I
2012?
think to some extent you say the deer problem, it's unlikely the deer problem's ever going to go away. We are a natural environment. But, for example, in North Haven, they have been doing a lot of culling, and the problem in North Haven is not, it was unbelievably bad 10 years ago. You literally couldn't drive down a road in North Haven without a deer
Same thing
hitting you.
with Shelter Island also.
And the culling has reduced the problem. Again, it hasn't eliminated it, it has made it more manageable. And that may be ultimately what the village needs to do, is manage it so it's not as severe.
It's going to need to get managed.
Right, right.
Why are we managing a health epidemic? They are tick carriers.
Yeah.
They carry illness.
Right, right.
There's a responsibility of the state to do something.
Right.
sue the state, you'll get attention and maybe some action, not years, not years.
You're going to do it on a contingent basis?
I don't do anything on a contingent basis, but I do a lot for free.
I just want to say one thing on the
Yeah,
summary.
yeah,
I have an apartment in Manhattan, my wife and I. And if you have cockroaches
right,
and you spray and call them an exterminator, it's true that the cockroaches move
To the next
to
one.
another apartment. But what we're doing here is we're not letting the get rid of the cockroaches. There's a big distinction here, which you're drawing except for the front yard, between a law or whatever we're going to do to solve the deer problem in
Right.
the world,
yep,
and another to permit people
right,
to get rid of the deer, which are a health problem, and an aesthetic problem, and a danger problem. And if you just send that off and the trustees listen to you, we're going to be to nowhere.
No, I think everyone here thinks there should be a law. I just also, sometimes when we pass
What
code,
do we do tomorrow? That's what.
right, when we pass code, one I think that's helpful is for people to be clear what the impact is. And I guess one of the concerns that I always have is with deer fence laws or laws like that, I think a lot of people think, okay, we've now addressed the issue. It's not going to address the issue. It's going to make it easier for all of us who want to fence in our yards,
Right, well, that's
but
what-
it's not going to make
But
the...
that's what it's about.
Right.
Take a look, go by Whitefield, look at the front
Yeah?
on Hill Street. They have a 6-foot fence, you can't see it. They have hedges, and
Right, right.
the hedges in front are the least dense. If you look on the rest of the property, because it's just new there,
Right.
they're invisible. So you get back to the same story. What could Whitefield or any other owner do
Right.
tomorrow while all these wonderful studies or the
Right, no,
legislation?
that's, I agree with you.
To your point,
Right.
to the 6 foot fence, the 6 foot fence on Hill Street in front of Whitefield, it's beautiful, and one of the reasons it's beautiful is because you're able to see over it, and you're able to see the houses,
not.
the roof.
Yes, you are.
You are, and that's part of the beauty. It's not the wall.
If you go far
It's
away,
not
you
the
can see
wall.
over it.
No, you can
but
see
you
pretty
can
well.
see-
On
you
the
can see
sidewalk,
the-
there's a little pathway.
You can see through through the hedge in
That's
front of
right.
Whitefield
Well, you can't
because
see-
of the shade trees that are shading the
Right,
privet, not
right,
allowing the
right,
privet to
yeah,
grow. But you can't see over
my
it.
hedges, but do you know how long it takes to get them up there?
You-
That's the other thing.
you
If you
can't
pass
see.
the law tomorrow, you're not going to have privet hedges all over the place. They're going to buy the little 2-foot
Well, they're not allowed to.
things,
They're not
and it'll
permitted.
take 6, 7, 8
No,
years.
I think
before-
what, I think the building
You're not solving
inspector...
the problem.
No, that's not the way the law works. The
law
proposed
prohibits
law, the building inspector would require you to plant hedges of that height.
Right.
Well,
Height of the
and
fence.
people would go broke. They'd move out immediately.
Then
So-
don't do it.
Yeah,
That's,
well, I-
that is, again, I don't want to make it more difficult, but that's part of the economic impact of laws like this is those who
Tremendous.
can do and those who can't end up with a deer.
That's right.
I think what I suggest,
The deer are here, and the deer are in high population
Right.
because they have a great food source.
Right, right,
So as you take the food source away from them,
right.
they will either move on,
Right.
decline, or something. And again, they're not all leaving by
Right.
any means, because there'll still be food here.
Just think about
Okay.
when you're doing it, think about the cockroaches and what you're going to do tomorrow.
It's bigger
I'm
than
thinking about cockroaches, but anyway.
But in
If they
your,
go to the other apartments,
Right.
there's no question about it. That's right.
in your report to
People
the
do-
trustees, at least mention the need to get the state to do what the state should do.
Okay.
At
All right,
least
I want
Long Island,
to
we
wrap
could
this
do
up.
Nassau
So, I
County
mean,
and Suffolk.
I'm
Right.
would generally be in favor of the
Right,
deer
right.
fence law.
So we're talking about, we all are in favor of deer fence law. We think 8-foot fences on the
the side.
rear and side yards, none of us have issues with. We would like a little further study of the proper height and conditions in the front yards. And we want to note that this is not the ultimate answer to the deer problem, and it's going to involve other levels of government, and it's going to involve other methods. Is
Why don't we
that-
just try to get an answer as to what methods are available
Right, right.
to
Right,
cull or hunt?
Right, and we also would strongly recommend the trustees commission a study, as was done several years ago, to see what the, I mean, one thing that would be helpful if we pass a law like this, if we now know there are, making a number up, 552 deer in the village, and 3 years from now, we see there are 300, then
Right.
we see it's really had an impact.
Right.
If 3 years from now, we see there's 700, then we're like, well, maybe it's made some feet feel better, but it hasn't really. So those statistics, I mean, one thing that I was most fascinated by, and this is 2012, was a long time ago now,
Right.
in the history of deer, certainly, but
When it
at
happened
the
30 years.
time, what the study said is you think there's been an increase in their hassle.
Right.
It's actually they're being forced out into the open. So you're perceiving an increase, but it's actually the same deer, just now becoming
Not a
much more
closed
persistent.
system. They're coming in from
Right.
Bridgetown, from Easton, from
And I-
Chicago.
Right.
And I'm like,
Yeah.
there's only, I just want, would like
And
to
we
see
need to
clarification
clarify-
on whether it's may or
It should shall. It should be shall.
It should be shall. And also just clarification on if the fences, the gates do go through ARB or not.
They do.
They do. I believe they do, but I'll check.
They do.
I think that's already in the code.
Yeah.
It's probably why it shouldn't be there.
They require-
Okay, I want to bring up one other topic, which is very time sensitive. So
Just a procedural question, when is your recommendation?
we'll make a recommendation. There's 4 of us, so we have enough to pass a recommendation. We will forward it to
Should we
the
take a-
trustees. Yes.
The vote right now on that?
Everyone in favor?
Right?
Okay. We will get it to the trustees for their, I think they're having a public hearing again in 3 weeks on this issue.
No, it's,
Next week, Thursday.
Next week. We'll make sure it gets there before their public hearing.
thank you very much.
One other topic, very time sensitive. So when, in 2017, I wish Eduardo was here because he has the history. So I should go back a little bit. In 2007, as part of the comprehensive reform of the zoning code, one of the things we did was we distinguished attached garages and permitted a detached garage to be within 5 feet of the property line. And that was for 2 reasons. One is because we wanted to encourage detached garages, which historically have been the pattern of the village, because garage in this village generally started out as barns or sheds that had been converted. And secondly, it created a pattern which we thought really fit the nature of Southampton, which was a garage that was at the side and then a house that was in the middle and apart from each other. And that's been followed, by virtually everybody. I think there's been very, very few attached garages built since that was passed. A few have, but most are detached. And there's been hundreds of houses built in that row. In 2017, we amended, I think you were on the commission at the time, certainly Eldon and Mark were. We passed a rule, we amended the setback rule as part of our new zoning study, requiring a 15-foot setback. And unbeknownst to us, and I guess the trustees at the time, when the village attorney at the time, I guess, wrote the code, he removed from the code the provision for detached garages. None of us realized it immediately, and then in the last month or two, everyone became aware of it, and you now have potentially a problem of massive non-compliance in the village, because virtually no one could meet that.
Right.
And also, people now who are applying for permits are being told they have to place their garages 15 feet off the line, which in many cases is virtually impossible to do, so they have no choice but to do an attached garage.
Right.
So the trustees asked us to address this issue, and so I'd like to propose a resolution that the law permitting detached garages to be 5 feet from the property line be put back.
Exactly.
They have to actually put it back. The law has to be passed again. So,
I would
any
strongly
discussion?
support
Yep,
Yeah.
I would support it.
this. I support
Fine.
too.
So should
Okay.
we vote on that one too?
Yep.
Yeah, so let's definitely make
Aye.
this.
I'm in support of that.
Okay.
That's absolutely.
Okay.
Yes,
Thank you.
perfect.
That's it for tonight, I think. That was certainly an interesting conversation.
Yes.
Good.
Yeah. Yeah. Thank you.
Paul?
Make a
Yes,
motion.
we're done. We make a motion to close the meeting.
Close.
Close.
Second.